A man can be below bare minimum effort today, but he doesn't have to be tomorrow, okay? He can be entitled today, but he doesn't have to be tomorrow. While we are strategizing in what seems to be the bleakest of times, we are hoping for and creating a better world, a better future. Speaking of a better future, it seems like it's almost here. The men are waking up.
Very considerate, very clean, very demure. I'm not like these other husbands.
Very demure, very custom. I'm not like these other husbands. She says to get it done, I get it done without complaining.
I'm very considerate with my slices, very considerate with my cooking.
I say, yes, ma'am, I'm very respectful.
I wanted to pinpoint exactly when the pygmification of women happened. And now that women are able to own and produce resources, we are much better poised to undo this pygmification and reset the dating market and make men pygmies again. Hey bestie, welcome to the Spoiled Girly Support Group podcast where we talk about how to get that bag while also securing your own bag. I'm your host Elle, and let's get into it. On today's episode, we are talking about the rise of very demure and very mindful men. And today's conversation wouldn't be complete without talking about the history of courtship and dating, so we can figure out exactly how we got here, how we got to the rise of very demure and very mindful men. Now, I know there's been a lot of negativity when it comes to dating and men in general, so I wanted to take today's class in a more positive direction because I feel like people don't believe me whenever I say that I love good men. In the Spoiled Girly Support Group, we love good men, and it's probably because we don't talk about good men enough. So I think it's time to set the record straight that in the Spoiled Girly Support Group, we love good men. We were raised by good men. We are surrounded by good men. Like, good men are all that exist in our reality. So I wanted to talk about the examples of good men that exist. And it may seem like there's not a lot of them nowadays, and we've already talked about it in a past class. The good men are offline, okay? The good men are offline. They're not online spreading their hate and their bitterness at women. Like, they're just not, okay? Like, why do you expect to find good men in a hate-filled comment section in hate-filled online groups? Okay, so make it make sense. And I also wanted to take today's class to explore exactly when the con of women having to be pygmies for men, auditioning for men started, because how did we go from being the literal gatekeepers of life of humanity into fighting over men, devaluing ourselves, and lowering our standards to Earth's crust levels just to allow men to access us? And how can we recover from that? So today we're going to explore how we can cure the pygmy disease. Because I don't know about you, but I am ready to make men pygmies again. Now we have a lot to cover, but before we get into it, I need you to hit the like, subscribe, and the notification bell so you never miss a Spoiled Girly episode. With that being said, let's get into it. Okay, so let's talk about the rise of very demure and very mindful men. And I can't do that without giving credit to Jools Lebron, who coined the term very demure and very mindful. She basically does a series of videos talking about the very demure and very mindful, literally common sense etiquette that everyone should know. So she went viral, and the term spawned a bunch of videos of people talking about their own very demure and very mindful behavior.
You see how I do my makeup for work? Very demure, very mindful. I don't come to work with a green cut crease. I don't look like a clown when I go to work. I don't do too much. I'm very mindful while I'm at work. See how I look very presentable? The way I came to the interview is the way I go to the job.
And okay, I am obsessed with this trend because I'm here for it, okay? I am here for the demure and mindful content because as much as I love me a good feral era, it is much easier to exist in society when everyone is mostly demure and mindful. So I'm all for this, okay? And it was just a cutesy, demuretsy trend, and then men started hopping on it. And for once, okay, for once, it's actually a good thing. So let's get into it.
What did you say?
Do you see how I'm pumping in gas so my wife doesn't have to tomorrow? Very thoughtful, very mindful, very demure. Do you see how I'm holding the gas nozzle so my wife doesn't have to get her hands dirty? Very considerate, very clean, very demure. I'm not like these other husbands. Do you see how I'm opening the door for my wife? Very respectful, very cutesy, very demure.
I love seeing women win. And we've already talked about this in past classes. All these videos may or may not be 100% accurate. They may not be real, but Just because it's not real doesn't mean it's not useful. Okay, so today's class is a rewiring class, a resetting class. Like, we gotta reset ourselves to our factory settings, okay? It is to alleviate the pessimism that we've been getting into because, yes, there are plenty of bad men. Okay, they're all over the news. There are plenty of below bare minimum effort men asterisk, and while we are strategizing on how to avoid them in real time, we can't forget that good men exist, good people exist. Call me an optimist, but I still believe that most people are inherently good up until society corrupts them into becoming otherwise. So yeah, it's good to do a mental reset, a mental rewiring now and then because it really grounds you and helps you move through the world with fresh eyes and an open heart. Speaking of grounding yourself, let's talk about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. If you've been in the Spoiled Girly support group, you know how much I support people getting therapy. And I practice what I preach, okay? I've sought therapy on and off throughout the years, and earlier this year, I signed up with BetterHelp. I have had an amazing experience with my therapist, shout out to my therapist, through BetterHelp. And ever since then, I have recommended BetterHelp to my friends and family. And because I've had such a great experience, I was so excited when BetterHelp wanted to work together. BetterHelp is a platform where therapists and their clients can communicate effectively and get the most out of therapy. There's a journal inside the platform for personal reflection, and there are group sessions on a number of different topics available every day. The way that BetterHelp makes finding a licensed, qualified, and aligned therapist is unmatched. Just fill out a questionnaire and you will match with a therapist in as little as a couple days. And if you don't vibe with your current therapist, say less. They'll match you with a new therapist, no questions asked. It is so nice to have a safe space to talk and get guided help from an expert whenever I'm feeling stuck or just overcome with emotion that it's keeping me from being my best self and living my best life. Like, that's not a vibe. So if you're struggling and think you'd benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/manifestl and get 10% off your first month of therapy. That's betterhelp.com/manifestl to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Now back to the topic. So let's keep watching very demure and very mindful men.
You see how I covered this ugly popcorn ceiling with fine cedar because my wife asked me to? Very demure, very custom. I'm not like these other husbands. She says to get it done, I get it done without complaining. Do it myself and do it well. Custom cuts gotta go around the AC unit. She even puts cutesy clips in my hair to keep my hair out of my way when I'm running the saw. Very demure, very safe, very cutesy. See how I do this TikTok trend because my wife asked me to without complaining, even though I'm in the middle of my project? Very demure, very classy, very mindful. Husbands, remember, be demure.
Look at this man. He's building something all on his own. He didn't need her to build with him. Very demure, very mindful, very independent. He didn't need anyone to build with me. He wasn't saying, oh, why are you filming? Why don't you build with me? Next.
I said, look at how I'm cutting these slices, these potatoes for my wife. Very demure, very cutesy. I'm mindful of small cuts. I am not like these other husbands when I cook for my wife. I'm very considerate with my slices, very considerate with my cooking for my wife. Very demure.
Very demure, very cutesy.
These potatoes specifically chosen, very demure for my wife. Very considerate as a husband.
You're very mindful.
I'm mindful of what she wants and what she needs. Very cutesy, very demutesy. You know?
That was very demure and very mindful mise en place. Love that. Love.
You see how I open the door for my wife? Very demure. Do you see how I rub my wife's feet when she asks without complaining? Very modest, very cutesy. You see how I make my wife's late night snack? I say, yes ma'am, I'm very respectful. I cut it up into pieces, not too big, not too small. I'm very mindful, I'm very demure.
I love this trend. I can't.
See how I let my wife sleep in the morning? Very demure, very mindful. I'm not like these other husbands. I don't clank around in the morning trying to wake her up, making noise. I don't do too much. I'm very cutesy with it. Now I'm gonna go make her some coffee. Very considerate. Be mindful why she married you.
Exactly. Be mindful why she married you. Let's get into the comments.
The Guy Demure vids are warming my whole heart.
Mine too. Honestly, like, I love seeing this. Like, I love seeing positive behavior. I love seeing women win. Like, love that for them. Just eat it up. Someone said,
I show up to the job how I showed up to the interview is great marriage advice.
I love that line. How I show up to the job is how I show up to the interview. Because let's talk about it. Like, people will lie about everything to get the job, and then when you're situated, they switch up on you. Like, one question I always get asked is about love bombing. Like, how do you distinguish between love bombing and just good treatment? And I can't really fully explain it other than use your discernment. Okay. And then I saw this post on Instagram, and it basically said that love bombing doesn't work on me because I leave the moment it stops. And I'm like, that's so true. And also, love bombing wouldn't work on me because I would just think that it's normal. Like, I wouldn't be able to tell. You know, like, for some people, like, love bombing is basically normal behavior that a woman should expect from a man. Like, what do you mean this isn't what women should get when they're dating? Like, this is normal. Like, love bombing wouldn't work on me because it's normal. Like, this is exactly how I should be treated all the time. So when you surround yourself with people who love you, first of all, when you love yourself and then you surround yourself with people who love you, a man showing you love in the initial dating stages is normal. Okay, like, it's not this whole extraordinary magical thing. It's not a whole new world. It's not that. Like, it's normal. Okay. So the moment that the positive treatment at that level stops, you get the ick. You stop engaging as well. Because let's talk about it. Love bombing only works if you fall in love. So don't. As humans, yeah, like, we have these physical attachments to people, like our chemistry reacts a certain way when they're around, but that's not love. That's infatuation. Okay? That's a response to stimulus. And when we keep exposing ourselves to these people and getting that chemical response, we associate that person with that chemical response. Like, we literally get hooked on them. Like, they're a I guess I can say that. Like, they're a substance, okay? Because they stimulated our pleasure pathways and they've literally become a substance that we're hooked on. So when they leave, we feel like absolute crap. Like, we go through withdrawal, like we have a come down. And it's because the source of the rush of our feel-good endorphins is gone. So falling in love is basically our body betraying us. And love bombers know that. They're like shady dealers, you know? Like, they get you hooked on freebies, you get hooked, and then you keep coming back. That's literally what love bombing is. So how do you know if it's love bombing or it's just plain good treatment? Number one, see how long it lasts. And number two, see how the women in his circles are treated, okay? Like, if they're treated like crap, like, that's your future, okay? You're not special. You're not the exception to the rule. Like, look at the women around him. Are they stressed? Are they hating life? Or are they glowing, vibing, and thriving, okay? And number three, just be in your discernment, okay? Like, we could come up with all these rule books and blueprints and stuff. Like, no, like, just use your discernment, okay? You'll know. Now, speaking of men treating women well, let's talk about the history of dating, which is actually a history of courtship, because apparently courtship came before dating, because dating is actually a very new thing. So if you're having trouble navigating dating, like, take it easier on yourself, okay? Give yourself some grace, because we're new to this. This is new, okay? So we can't have figured it out. And also, I wanted to get into the history of courtship and dating because I wanted to pinpoint exactly when the pygmification of women happened. And now that women are able to own and produce resources, we are much better poised to undo this pygmification and reset the dating market and make men pygmies again. With all that being said, let's get into the history of courtship. First, what even is courtship? Courtship is the period wherein some couples get to know each other prior to a possible marriage or committed romantic de facto relationship. Courtship traditionally may begin after a betrothal and may conclude with a celebration of marriage. A courtship may be an informal and private matter between two people or may be a public affair or a formal arrangement with family approval. Traditionally, in the case of a formal engagement, it is the role of a male to actively court or woo a female, thus encouraging her to understand him and her receptiveness to a marriage proposal. Basically, before dating came about in the late 1800s to early 1900s, the progression to marriage went like this. It's betrothal to courtship to marriage. And dating came about during the turn of the century and became an added layer between courtship and marriage. And we also have to take into account that a lot of women didn't have the luxury of choosing. So for many women, it was betrothal, then marriage, completely bypassing courtship and or dating. And perhaps one of the oldest examples of courtship can be found in the Bible in the book of Genesis. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said to her father, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban, the father, said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. And here's the tea. Laban, the dad, he gives Jacob Leah instead. Leah is Rachel's older sister, and so Jacob worked another 7 years to finally get married to Rachel. It was this whole thing, and it really sets the stage for the courtship model that we see today, where a man works to gain the favor of a woman's father, and in societies where women are more free, the man works to gain the favor of the woman herself. Jacob literally worked 14 years to get Rachel's hand in marriage. So, what did this man do for you? Okay. Historically, men have been the pick-me's for women. It's because biologically, female reproduction is so much more costly than the male version. Women get pregnant, women give birth, women breastfeed, and women rear babies, and plenty of women die doing that. And if a woman survives all of that, from getting pregnant to rearing a baby, all of that happens in about 1 year plus. So contrast that with men being able to fertilize eggs minimum once a day and being able to just walk away. And while women are doing all of that, plus running the risk of literally dying to ensure the survival of the species, men are supposed to theoretically support women through all of that. Like, that's their job, is the least they could do. So this biologically imposed scarcity is why men perform for women, why historically men have been the pick-me's for women. And so this explains the biological pick-meification of men. So speaking of men being pick-me's for women, let's talk about courtship even more. Pre-1100s, marriages were mostly set up by parents or older relatives. It wasn't really about love. It was more about keeping the family legacy going, ensuring financial security, or making political connections. And because of this, there wasn't much of a need for a dating phase like we think of it today. Marriage was more of a formal, long-term agreement recognized by the community, and it usually involved a man and a woman and often have like a transactional vibe. Wives were sometimes seen as property, transferred from their father to their husband, mainly for the purpose of having children. Society put a lot of pressure on people to pair up, and marriages were seen as a way to keep the peace, because if there's a woman available, like, the men can keep their heads on straight, and they cause conflict within society. So society really wanted women off limits and married off. So for most of human history and even into the Middle Ages in Europe, marriage was basically a business deal between families. Romance or love matches, as we know it today, was more of a secret side thing. It happened outside of marriage in secret, like, low-key meetups. In a 12th century book, The Art of Courtly Love, it even claimed that true love can't exist between husband and wife. Back then, sneaky meetups between men and women, usually outside of marriage or before tying the knot, were kind of like the early version of what we would now call dating. Essentially, romance, love matches, love, it wasn't a thing. Starting around the 1700s, there was a global shift towards empowering individuals, leading to more freedom and equality, especially for women. Men and women started becoming more equal in politics, money matters, and social status. And this reminds me of this post that I saw about the 18th century, aka the 1700s. If you asked me what I thought about the 18th century, I'd say it was the last time the human imagination was free from the constraints of rationalism and positivism, when a woman could say she'd given birth to rabbits and people would believe her. It was the last time men and women weren't seen as two incommensurate sexes, a time before women were completely set apart in a private sphere. It produced the campiest, most experimental, and funniest literature we've ever seen. It's a time when art and architecture echoed the classics while promising a bright future. It was the age when some of our most useful institutions, libraries, museums, the postal service came into being. A time when women supported themselves with their writing, and the age when feminism as we know it was born. It saw the rise of the novel and end of the great epic poetry. It was the age of revolutions, when the French, Americans, and Haitians showed that monarchy and slavery-based colonialism wasn't the only way society could function. It was when the modern world as we know it began to take shape, but before industrialization turned people into machines and the environment into a wasteland for humans' overconsumption, a time when craftsmanship ensured long-lasting products, and it had the best fashion. And I never really got the obsession with 18th century everything until this post. Like, that's why, like, Marie Antoinette, Sofia Coppola, like, that aesthetic is so pervasive. Like, I get it now because of this post. Like, mind blown. Like someone just had to tell me that. Now, all these changes in the 1700s really shook up relationships. People had more of a say over who they married, when, and whether they married at all. And at first, courtship was pretty formal, like with young women hosting gentlemen callers at home, always with a chaperone nearby. And the most immediate example of this is in the Netflix TV show Bridgerton. And in the show, we see the debutante season, and it's basically a social competition for marriage. It's a fancy whirlwind time filled with balls, garden parties, and tons of drama. And the show also had a heavy emphasis on how much reputation and public opinion matter in the courtship game, with families constantly negotiating who their daughters will end up with, almost like it was a business deal. In short, courtship was a lot more formal and structured than dating today. Like, it's not swiping left or right, going on all these dates. It was all about social class, family connections, and keeping up appearances. While today, love and personal connection are front and center, in the 18th century, getting married was mostly about securing your place in society, finding financial stability, and making good family alliances. And the rules were strict, especially for women who had to follow all these social norms to keep their reputation and their chances of landing a good match intact. Now, I want to hold pause here because here we see how women are performing for men, for the male gaze, for male approval. And this is because in the 1700s, although it was a time of change, life for women was full of restrictions, especially when it came to money and property. Unlike today, women in most parts of the world didn't have the legal right to own property or handle their finances independently. That meant that for many women, finding a husband wasn't just about love or compatibility or companionship, it was essential for their security and survival. Marriage was often the only way for a woman to have a stable life, access wealth, or even have a say in her own household. And if you've watched Bridgerton, although it is set in the early 1800s, I know, Penelope's family is plagued by this problem of women being unable to hold property. Like, it was such a huge issue. And the only way they could keep themselves from being homeless and destitute was to get married. And even when they got married, the daughters still had to produce a male heir. Now, why are we talking about this? And why is it crucial to the social pygmification of women versus the biological pygmification of men? It's because at this point in time, men monopolized the access to and production of resources. Women didn't have a choice but to attach themselves to men for survival. Women, whether single or married, were considered legally dependent on their closest male relatives, like their fathers, brothers, or husbands. And if a woman was single, her father or her male guardian usually managed her finances. But if she married, everything she owned or might inherit legally belonged to her husband. And there's a legal term for this, okay? It's called coverture. Coverture is the legal framework that meant that a married woman couldn't own property, enter into contracts, or sue anyone in her own right. She was seen as part of her husband's identity and not as a person with independent legal standing. And because of these laws, finding a husband became crucial for most women. And this led to the rise of the societal pygmification of women. Without the ability to own property or earn a stable income, a woman's financial security depended on marriage. If a woman remained single, she had very few options. She might be seen as a burden to her family, or if she had no male relatives, she could be left in a very vulnerable position. Widows could inherit some property, but even then, their rights were very limited, and many would be pressured to remarry quickly to secure their status. Long story short, courtship in the 1700s was kind of like playing a high-stakes game with a lot of rules. It wasn't about falling in love the way we think of it today. It was more about making the right moves for your family, for your future, and your social standing. Families were deeply involved, and every step of the way had to be carefully planned out. And despite all these rules, it was the way to find love, or at least a suitable match, in a time when reputation and status were everything. And another example is Hamilton the musical, which is set in the late 1700s to early 1800s. In the musical, Alexander Hamilton and his wife's sister, Angelica Schuyler, I know, it's T, his wife's sister. In the musical, it was clear that Alexander and Angelica had chemistry going on, like they meet for the first time, there was tension, there were sparks, there was intellectual sparring, there was banter, like they were a match for each other. In Angelica's words,
The conversation lasted 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. Everything was said in total agreement. It's a dream, it's a bit of a dance, a bit of a posture, it's a bit of a stance. He's a bit of a flirt, but I'm gonna give it a chance.
but Angelica, eldest daughter, court, she saw that her younger sister, Eliza, thought Alexander was cute and she was enamored with him. So Angelica relented and let Eliza fall in love with Alexander. And there's this whole song entitled Satisfied that she dedicated to explaining her decision to not pursue a relationship with Alexander. She sings that she realized 3 fundamental truths at the exact same time. Number 1,
I'm a girl in a world in which my only job is to marry rich. My father has no sons, so I'm the one who has a social climb for one. So I'm the oldest and the wittiest, and the gossip in New York City is insidious, and Alexander's penniless. Doesn't mean I love him any less.
and I mean, she ate with that. Okay? And number 2,
He's after me because I'm a scholar sister that elevates his status aside. Have to be naive to set that aside. Maybe that is why.
I mean, was she wrong though? And if you're not into history or into Hamilton, the Schuyler sisters were very, very, very wealthy. And what do we say? Men are the original gold diggers. And that's okay. Like, I just want to be clear on that. So whenever you're accused of being a gold digger, you'd flinch a little less, you know? Now, back to the topic. The third reason is Angelica saw her sister Eliza falling in love with him, so she let her have him. So this was the vibe of 1700s courtship. It wasn't motivated by love. It was motivated by survival. Now, we're getting into the 1800s. The 1800s courtship culture saw more freedom compared to the 1700s. There's still a pressure to secure a good match, and marriage is still largely a business affair. By the early 19th century, courtship began to focus more on personal compatibility and actual feelings. People started to believe that love should have a bigger role in choosing a partner, and the idea that you could marry for love instead of just social status or family pressure started to gain some ground. And people are starting to think like, maybe we should like each other too. Like, maybe we should love the person that we're going to spend the rest of our lives with. Like, just throwing it out there, crazy idea. Speaking of love letters actually started in the 1700s, and they were still popular in the late 1800s, but there were a lot more social events where people could actually interact and get to know each other. And this was also the era of the great ballrooms and endless dance cards. There were still rules like always being chaperoned, but the ballrooms were a bit more relaxed and there was more of a focus on genuine connection. And this time, women had a little more say in the matter, and flirting became more of an art. While you still had to be careful not to cross any lines because gossip was very big, there was more room to get to know each other through social events, parties, and outings. Now, this is where things changed a lot. The late 1800s was when dating became a thing. Courtship was beginning to happen outside of the home, in more public places. Instead of only having chaperone visits or more formal dances, couples started going out in public together. And it was still very proper and respectable, but it was the beginning of dating. Things like promenades in the park, you want a promenade? Attending a theater or going for a ride were becoming more common. And this was huge because this is revolutionary, okay? And it meant that people were starting to think of courtship as something more personal and less strictly about following the family rules. Now, by the end of the 1800s, the idea of marrying for love was much more accepted. It wasn't like the main thing, but it was more accepted. People started to see marriage as a partnership and not just a business deal. And women had slightly more freedom to make their own choices. Emphasis on slightly because society wasn't the way it is now. But at least it was becoming more about personal connection and less about just finding the best match for money and status. So let's get into the 1900s. One of the biggest shifts from the 1800s to the 1900s was the growing independence of women. As women began to gain more rights, like the right to vote, to own property, and work outside the home, they also started to have more say in their love lives. Shocker. Women weren't just waiting around for a man anymore. They were out there making their own choices about who they wanted to date. Basically, with women's regained freedom, because remember, we had all of this before when we were living in matrilineal societies before patriarchy came about. So because of this regained freedom, women are now reversing their societal pygmification. In the 1920s, also called the Roaring Twenties, with the jazz clubs, flapper fashion, and like the wild parties, it made dating a lot more social and more fun. Couples were more likely to go out for a good time rather than just get to know each other for marriage, and the idea of dating around became more accepted, and people started to see dating as something you did to have fun and explore different relationships before settling down. By the 1950s, the concept of the date night was in full swing. So going out to the movies, grabbing a milkshake at the diner, or cruising around in the car, these were all popular date ideas. This was the era of the high school romances and young love. Dating was still about finding the one, but there was more emphasis on having fun together. And also, thanks to the economic boom after World War II, more people had the money and freedom to go out and enjoy themselves. During this time, dating was also heavily influenced by the media. So Hollywood movies and TV shows, they romanticized the idea of dating as a key part of life. Couples were often portrayed as the ideal team. So, like, think of the classic going steady phrase, which meant you were officially a couple and off the market. Whereas before, you literally were single until you were married. Then came the 1960s and 1970s, and everything started to change. The schmexual revolution, the rise of feminism, and counterculture movement flipped traditional dating norms on their head. People started questioning the old school rules of dating and relationship, and the idea of free love emerged, meaning that people were more open to exploring different types of relationships without necessarily tying the knot. During these decades, the focus shifted from finding a marriage partner to finding yourself and what you really wanted in a relationship. There was more openness about premarital schmex, living together before marriage, and even experimenting with non-traditional relationship structures. This era was all about breaking boundaries and discovering new ways to connect with others. Now, I have beef with this era of dating because instead of women finding true freedom, true liberation during this time of revolution, this revolution was co-opted by people for their own benefit. This was the time when women started going from private property to public property. And at the time for the women, it was probably liberating, but now looking back, it was looking like it was another way for men to secure access to women's bodies to the detriment of these women. And we've already talked about this in a past class. So now let's move on to the 1990s. The 1990s brought even more changes thanks to the rise of technology. The internet started to become a thing, and with it came a whole new world of dating possibilities. Email, chat rooms, and instant messaging made it easier for people to connect even if they were miles apart. Online dating sites like Match.com launched in the mid-90s, and suddenly you could meet someone without ever leaving your house. And by the 2000s, online dating had gone mainstream, and with the rise of smartphones, dating apps like Tinder changed the game completely, and now finding a date was as easy as a swipe on your phone. The rules of courtship had completely shifted, and dating was faster, more casual, and definitely more varied. Whether you're looking for a serious relationship or just a fun night out, there's an app for that. As Steve Jobs said, there's an app for that. And at the same time, social media also started to play a huge role in dating. So platforms like MySpace and Facebook became new ways to meet people, check out potential dates, and even flirt. So posting the perfect selfie or sending a cute DM became part of the modern dating ritual. And speaking of social media, let's get into the 2010s. The 2010s brought the dating game to a whole new level with the rise of dating apps. So Tinder launched in 2012 and totally revolutionized how people dated. Suddenly, finding a date was as easy as swiping right. Dating apps made everything quicker, more visual, and more fun, depending on who you ask. No more long profiles or endless questionnaires. You just need a picture, a few lines, and a quick decision, and it's love at first swipe, theoretically. But Tinder was just the beginning, so soon there were apps for everyone. Bumble, where women make the first move. Hinge, which promised to be designed to be deleted, debatable, because it focused on meaningful connections. And niche apps for every interest, community, and preference. It became all about options, and there were plenty of options. With all these apps, dating became a lot more casual and diverse. So people started dating multiple people at once, going on more first dates and exploring different types of relationships. It was less about finding the one immediately and more about seeing what was out there. And now in 2024, we are seeing the detrimental effects of these dating apps on women. And we already talked about this in a past class, so check it out if you missed it. But they're not it anymore. Women are swearing them off en masse. And to add to that, we are now seeing a drop in birth rates, marriage rates. Women are joining all these movements, swearing off men. So what went wrong in modern dating and courtship? Well, what went wrong in modern dating and courtship was what went right for women. On top of us living in what some people would call late stage capitalism, which hot take is literally just capitalism. Women are well aware of the economic pressures of living in society. As a single woman, as a married couple, as parents to children, as you progress through those stages of life, it gets even more and more expensive. And on top of that, women are increasingly getting more educated and wealthier and can now afford to be choosier and hold off from choosing for a longer time. And because women are now choosier, a lot of men are not getting chosen. A lot of men are not getting picked. And for a lot of women who quote unquote date down, they're finding that the men just don't appreciate them or are resentful of them being more economically prolific. And so these men seek to humble them or disrespect them and hurt them and sometimes even unalive them. And overall, just bring their quality of life down. And so the women are now learning to stay single and not date down the economic ladder. And so all the disrespectful and overtly misogynistic behavior we are seeing in real life and in media is what some psychologists would call the extinction burst of unpicked men. But first, what is an extinction burst? An extinction burst is a sudden and dramatic increase in behavior when reinforcement for that behavior has been removed. It is a temporary response pattern and will diminish and then stop as the reinforcement for the behavior no longer follows the voluntary action. So for the longest time, by monopolizing and gatekeeping resources, keeping women from voting, from owning anything, from being educated, men have been conditioned to be entitled to women, and women have been conditioned to be pick-me's for men, i.e. the societal pick-mification of women. So when women started to gain rights to own things, to be educated, to work, to control their own reproduction, the socialization of men has not kept up with the times. Men have not kept up with the times. They still have this entitlement towards women in a world that ignores this entitlement. And instead of adapting, these men, they're doubling down on the entitled behavior. And this is best exemplified in men's weaponized incompetence. Women are largely becoming independent of men, but men are still largely dependent on the unpaid domestic labor of women. And so they double down on their dependence. They do things wrong on purpose. They mess things up every single time. They weaponize their incompetence so they can get out of unpaid domestic labor. And they are disrespecting women even more. They are scamming women even more. They're hurting women even more. They're unaliving women even more. This is textbook extinction burst. And I get so many comments about why the term below bare minimum effort men is so long. Like, can't I come up with like a shorter term? But that is the term for it because I believe that it is a reversible condition. Below bare minimum low effort. It's all about effort. A man can be below bare minimum effort today, but he doesn't have to be tomorrow, okay? He can be entitled today, but he doesn't have to be tomorrow, okay? See, like, I'm not into this whole nihilistic, pessimistic vibe. Like, the vibes are great here because while we are strategizing in what seems to be the bleakest of times, we are hoping for and creating a better world, a better future. Speaking of a better future, it seems like it's almost here. The men are waking up.
A message to men who are struggling with relationships. Don't panic. Men have been adapting since the beginning of time. It's in your genes, so it's a natural process. All your male ancestors are proof that you can adapt. What may not be obvious is the direction to adapt. Our social landscape is different than it was before. If you look at education statistics from the countries in the Organization of Economic Development and Cooperation, in my generation, 55 to 64, in about half of the countries, more women had tertiary or college degrees than men. In the generation 25 to 34, more women have college degrees than men in 100% of countries. That means women today can have good jobs, careers, financial independence. They do not need to be married to leave their parents' home. So where's the win? It's partnership.
While some below bare minimum effort men are in their extinction burst era, they're in their toddler throwing a tantrum era, other men are in their very demure and mindful era. They're catching up to women waking up. You are the prize. You are creation. You are the literal gatekeeper of humanity. You decide how your life looks like. You decide how the world looks like. And everyone else can catch up or get left behind. That's all I have for you today. I just wanted to let you know that you have so much inherent value and worth in a world that is hell-bent on devaluing you. And a big thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/manifestelle and get 10% off your first month of therapy. That's betterhelp.com/manifestelle and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Now get that bag, bestie. Also, bestie, wake up.